Alexander the Great, Rise of a Legend, Chapter 1, Son of Destiny, in the ancient kingdom of Macedon, where mountains rose like walls between worlds and warriors were forged from hardship. A child was born who would one day reshape history itself. His name was Alexander the Great, but at the moment of his birth, he was simply Alexander, the son of a king and a woman who believed he was destined for greatness. From the beginning, there were whispers. His mother, Olympias, was no ordinary queen. She was intense, devout, and fiercely protective of her son. Legends surrounded her stories that she had dreamt of lightning striking her womb, that divine forces had marked Alexander before he even entered the world. Whether truth or myth, one thing was certain: she believed he was chosen. His father, Philip II of Macedon, was a different kind of force, a warrior king, a strategist, a man who had transformed Macedon from a fractured land into a rising military power. Where Olympias gave Alexander a sense of destiny, Philip gave him something far more dangerous: ambition. From an early age, Alexander grew up between two powerful influences: his mother's belief in divine purpose and his father's relentless drive for conquest. It was a combination that would shape him into something the world had never seen before. But greatness is not inherited, it is tested. As a boy, Alexander was not sheltered in luxury. He was trained, hardened, expected to prove himself worthy of his bloodline. He learned to fight. Macedon was not a place for weakness, and the son of its king could not afford to be anything less than exceptional. One story would come to define his youth. A wild, horse-tamed, violent, impossible to control was brought before King Philip. No one could ride it. Warriors tried and failed, thrown to the ground again and again. The animal seemed possessed, its strength uncontrollable. Then, a young Alexander stepped forward. He did not see a beast, he saw fear. The horse was terrified of its own shadow. So Alexander turned it toward the sun, and then, calmly, he mounted it. The horse did not resist, it obeyed. From that moment, the world would remember the name Bucephalus, the horse that no man could tame, except a boy who understood what others did not. Philip watched in silence. Then he said words that would echo through history. Find yourself a kingdom equal to you. Macedon is too small. It was not just praise, it was recognition. Alexander was not meant to follow, he was meant to surpass. As he grew older, his education became as intense as his training. He was taught by one of the greatest minds of the ancient world, Aristotle. Under Aristotle, Alexander studied philosophy, science, medicine, and literature. He read of heroes like Achilles and began to see himself not just as a prince, but as part of a greater story, a story of glory, a story of immortality. Because in the ancient world, there was only one way to live forever, to be remembered. And Alexander intended to be remembered forever. But destiny is never simple. Behind the image of unity, tension grew within the royal family. Philip took new wives. Alliances shifted. Questions of succession began to emerge. Was Alexander truly the rightful heir, or would another take his place? The court became a battlefield of whispers and politics, and Alexander learned something critical. Power is not just taken on the battlefield, it is fought for in silence. Despite the tension, Philip continued expanding his influence. His ultimate goal was clear: to invade the mighty Persian Empire, the greatest power of the time. It was a dream of conquest on a scale never before attempted. But before that dream could be realized, everything changed. At a grand celebration, surrounded by nobles and allies, King Philip II was assassinated. The king was dead, and suddenly the world shifted beneath Alexander's feet. He was only 20 years old, too young, many believed, to hold such power, too inexperienced, too untested. Enemies began to move immediately. Rivals within the court saw opportunity. Greek city-states considered rebellion. The empire Philip had built stood on the edge of collapse, and at the center of it all stood Alexander, no longer a prince, now a king. But a crown is not power. Power must be taken. And Alexander understood this better than anyone. Within days, he acted. Rivals were eliminated. Threats were crushed. Rebellions were met with overwhelming force. The young king moved with a speed and decisiveness that shocked everyone who had doubted him. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty, only action, only control. And in that moment, the world realized something terrifying. This was not a boy inheriting a throne. This was a conqueror taking it. But even as he secured his position, Alexander's gaze turned outward, beyond Macedon, beyond Greece, toward something far greater. The Persian Empire, the ultimate prize, the challenge that would define his life. The dream his father had begun, but never lived to see. Alexander would not just continue that dream, he would surpass it, because he did not intend to conquer a kingdom. He intended to conquer the world. Chapter 2: The Fire of Conquest. The crown was secure, but Alexander the Great had no intention of ruling quietly. For him, power was not something to protect, it was something to expand. Beyond the borders of Macedon lay the greatest empire the world had ever seen, the vast and wealthy Achaemenid Empire, ruled by Darius III. It stretched across continents, commanding armies beyond counting, cities beyond imagination, and resources that dwarfed anything Macedon possessed. To most rulers, it was untouchable. To Alexander, it was inevitable. But before he could conquer Persia, he had to do something far more dangerous. He had to leave everything behind. In 334 BCE, Alexander made his move. With an army of roughly 40,000 men, small compared to the forces he would face, he marched toward the edge of Europe. Before him lay the narrow strait known as the Hellespont, the boundary between his world and the unknown. Crossing it was more than a military act. It was a declaration. Once he stepped into Asia, there would be no turning back. Legend says that when Alexander reached the Asian shore, he threw a spear into the ground and claimed the land as his by right of conquest. Whether myth or truth, the message was clear. He had not come to raid. He had come to take everything. The Persian Empire did not ignore him. Satraps, regional governors, quickly gathered forces to stop the invasion before it could gain momentum. They chose their ground carefully, positioning their army along the banks of the Granicus River. It was a natural barrier, difficult to cross, perfect for breaking an advancing army. It should have stopped him. It did not. Alexander did something that defined his entire campaign. He attacked immediately. No delay, no hesitation. His generals advised caution. Crossing a river under enemy fire was dangerous, even reckless. But Alexander understood something they did not. Speed was his greatest weapon. If he gave Persia time, they would overwhelm him with numbers. So he chose risk. The Macedonian army advanced. The rivers surged against them as they crossed, water crashing against shields and armor. Persian forces waited on the opposite bank, ready to strike as soon as the Macedonians lost formation, and then nimpicked. The battle erupted in chaos. Cavalry clashed at the river's edge, horses screamed, spears shattered. The current turned red with blood. It was not a clean battle, it was brutal, disordered, violent, and at the center of it all was Alexander. He did not command from the rear, he led from the front. Riding into the thick of combat, he targeted the Persian commanders directly. In ancient warfare, killing leaders could break an army faster, and Alexander knew exactly where to strike. One by one, Persian nobles fell. The structure of their command began to collapse. At one moment, one decisive, fragile moment, Alexander himself came close to death. Surrounded, struck, nearly overwhelmed, he was saved only by the intervention of his companion, Cletus the Black, who cut down the Persian warrior about to kill him. It was a reminder, even legends can fall, but not that day. The Macedonian line held, then advanced, then broke the enemy completely. The Battle of the Granicus was over, and with it, something irreversible had begun. This was not just a victory, it was proof that the Persian Empire could be beaten, proof that Alexander was not just ambitious, he was capable. Cities across Asia Minor began to fall, one after another. Some resisted and were crushed, others surrendered, hoping to avoid destruction. Alexander moved quickly, securing coastal regions to weaken Persian naval power and cutting off their ability to strike behind him. But more importantly, he was building something larger than conquest. He was building momentum. Every victory made the next one easier. Every success drew more followers. Every step forward made retreat impossible. And far to the east, Darius III was watching. The King of Kings, ruler of the greatest empire on earth. He had underestimated Alexander once. He would not make that mistake again. Because this was no longer a minor invasion. This was war. And the next battle would not be fought against satraps or regional forces. It would be fought against the full power of Persia itself, an empire against a king who refused to stop. And as Alexander stood victorious on the battlefield, surrounded by the fallen and the echoes of war, one truth became undeniable. He had crossed into Asia as a challenger. But he would not remain one for long. He was becoming something else, something greater, something far more dangerous. Chapter 3: Clash of Kings. The victory at the Granicus River had shattered doubt, but it had not yet shaken the heart of the Achaemenid Empire. For that, Alexander the Great would have to face the man who ruled it all, Darius III, the King of Kings. Unlike the satraps Alexander had defeated, Darius commanded the full weight of an empire that stretched from Egypt to India. His resources were vast, his armies immense. And now he was no longer watching from a distance. He was coming. The two forces moved toward each other like storms drawn together by fate. Alexander advanced deeper into Asia, securing cities and supply lines, refusing to slow down. Darius gathered a massive army, determined to crush the invader with overwhelming force. But numbers alone do not win wars, terrain does, and fate, it seemed, favored Alexander. The confrontation came near the narrow coastal plains of Issus. It was a place where mountains pressed close to the sea, leaving little room to maneuver. For a vast Persian army, it was a nightmare. Their numbers, once their greatest advantage, became a limitation. They could not fully deploy, they could not surround, they could not overwhelm. Alexander saw it instantly, and he did not hesitate. The Macedonian army formed with precision. At its core stood the phalanx rows of soldiers, armed with long spears, shields locked together like a moving wall. On the flanks, cavalry waited, ready to strike at the right moment. And at the head of it, old Alexander. He rode not as a king observing battle, but as a weapon within it. The moment came, the armies collided. The battlefield erupted into chaos, metal striking metal, men shouting, horses crashing through lines of infantry. The Persian forces pushed forward, their numbers pressing against the Macedonian formation. For a moment, it seemed as though sheer mass might break Alexander's army. But the phalanx held, and then Alexander made his move. Instead of meeting the Persian army evenly, he concentrated his force on one critical point, Darius himself, because Alexander understood something deeper than strategy. War is not just about armies, it is about leadership. Break the king, and you break the empire. With a wedge of elite cavalry, Alexander drove straight toward the center, where Darius stood in his royal chariot, surrounded by his guards. It was a bold move, dangerous, direct, almost reckless, but it worked. The Macedonian charge tore through Persian lines like a blade. Confusion spread. Orders became unclear. Units began to falter. And then the unthinkable happened. Darius III, king of kings, turned and fled. In that single moment, the battle was decided. Because when a king runs, his army does not stand. Panic spread across the Persian ranks. What had been a powerful, organized force collapsed into chaos. Soldiers abandoned their positions. Commanders lost control. The battlefield became a storm of retreat and slaughter. The Macedonians pressed forward relentlessly. Victory was complete, but the consequences went far beyond the battlefield. In the aftermath, Alexander captured something even more valuable than territory. Darius's family, his mother, his wife, his children. They had been left behind in the chaos of flight, expecting death or humiliation at the hands of their enemy. But Alexander did something unexpected. He treated them with respect, with dignity. He did not see them as spoils of war, but as symbols of his growing authority. This was not just conquest, this was transformation. Because from this moment on, Alexander was no longer just a Macedonian king invading Persia. He was becoming something greater, a ruler of Persia itself. News of the defeat spread across the empire like wildfire. The myth of Persian invincibility shattered. Cities began to question their loyalty. Governors hesitated. Balance of power shifted. And Darius, the king of kings, was now a king without certainty. But he was not finished. He would raise another army, a larger one, a stronger one, and he would face Alexander again. Because one battle does not decide an empire, but it does reveal the truth. And the truth was now clear. Alexander was not just winning, he was rewriting the rules of war. Chapter 4. The fall of king's defeat at Issus had shaken the Achaemenid Empire, but it had not destroyed it. Empires of that scale do not fall from a single blow. They bend, they gather strength, and then they strike back. Darius III would not run again. This time, he would prepare. Across the vast lands of his empire, he summoned everything: infantry, cavalry, mercenaries, and elite guards. From distant provinces they came, forming an army unlike anything Alexander had faced before. It was not just large, it was overwhelming. But Darius did not make the same mistake twice. He chose the battlefield carefully. A wide, open plain near Gaugamela, flat, vast, and deliberately cleared of obstacles. The ground was even leveled to maximize the effectiveness of one terrifying weapon: scythed chariots, blades mounted on wheels, designed to tear through infantry formations, to break lines, to create chaos. This was where Darius would end the war, and this was where Alexander chose to meet him. When the Macedonian army arrived, the scale of what they faced was undeniable. The Persian army stretched across the horizon, its numbers dwarfing everything Alexander commanded. To many, it must have seemed like the end. But Alexander did not see numbers. He saw weakness. Because even the largest army in the world can be broken if you know where to strike. The night before the battle, his generals urged a surprise attack under cover of darkness. It would reduce the Persian advantage, catch them unprepared, tilt the odds. Alexander refused. "I will not steal my victory." It was more than pride. It was psychological warfare. He wanted the world to see what would happen. Morning came. The armies faced each other in silence before the storm. Then the battle began. The Persian advance was immediate. Chariots surged forward, blades spinning, designed to shatter the Macedonian phalanx. The ground thundered beneath them as they closed the distance. But Alexander had anticipated this. At the last moment, the phalanx opened its ranks. The chariots passed through gaps instead of cutting through men, and then they were surrounded, neutralized, destroyed. The Persian advantage collapsed before it could take effect. But the battle was far from over. Darius's army pressed forward in massive waves, trying to envelop the Macedonians, to use their numbers to crush them from all sides. The pressure mounted, the lines strained. This was the moment the Persians had prepared for. And then Alexander moved, not backward, not defensively, forward. He shifted his army at an angle, pulling part of the Persian force out of position, creating a gap small, but enough. Enough for a king who knew exactly how to exploit it. With his elite cavalry, Alexander formed a wedge and drove directly toward the heart of the Persian army, toward Darius. Again, it was the same strategy, but executed with even greater precision. The Macedonian charge cut through resistance, breaking formations, collapsing lines. Dust filled the air. Commands were lost in the chaos. The battlefield became fragmented, unstable, and in the center of it all stood Darius, watching, waiting, and then breaking. For the second time, the King of Kings turned his chariot and fled. And for the second time, his army collapsed with him. But this time, there would be no recovery. The Persian forces disintegrated completely. What had been the greatest army in the world dissolved into panic and retreat. The battlefield belonged to Alexander, decisively, irreversibly. This was not just a victory. It was the end of an empire. After Gaugamela, nothing stood between Alexander and the heart of Persia. The great cities Babylon, Susa, Persepolis lay open before him. The wealth of an empire, accumulated over generations, now belonged to a single man. And yet, the war was not truly over, because Darius still lived, a king without an empire, a ruler without a throne. And as long as he lived, the idea of resistance remained. So Alexander pursued relentlessly, across deserts, across mountains, across the collapsing remains of Persian authority. But he would not be the one to end Darius. That fate would come from within, betrayed by his own men, abandoned by those who once served him. Darius III was captured and killed before Alexander could reach him. When Alexander finally found his body, he did something few expected. He honored him, not as an enemy, but as a king. Because Alexander no longer saw himself as the destroyer of Persia. He saw himself as its successor. With Darius dead, the Achaemenid Empire did not just fall, it transformed, and at its center stood a new ruler, not Persian, not entirely Macedonian anymore, but something else, something greater. Alexander was no longer just a conqueror. He was now the king of Asia. The battle at Gaugamela had ended an empire, but it had not ended ambition. Because for Alexander the Great, victory was never the final goal. It was only the beginning. With Darius III dead and the Achaemenid Empire shattered, the gates of Persia stood open. There were no more great armies to stop him, no more kings to challenge him, only cities. And the first of them was Babylon. When Alexander approached, there was no resistance, no siege, no battle. The city surrendered. Its gates opened wide, and its people came out to greet him not as an enemy, but as a liberator. After years of war and uncertainty, they saw in Alexander something unexpected: stability, order, power. He entered Babylon not as a destroyer, but as a king. And for the first time, something changed. He did not sack the city. He did not burn it. He preserved it. Temples were respected. Traditions were maintained. Officials were kept in place. It was a decision that surprised many of his own men, but it revealed a new strategy. Alexander was no longer just conquering the Persian Empire. He was claiming it. From Babylon, he moved to Susa, one of the richest cities in the world. Their unimaginable wealth fell into his hands. Gold, silver, treasures accumulated over centuries, enough to fund endless campaigns, enough to reshape economies, enough to fuel a vision far greater than war. And yet, the most symbolic moment of his conquest still lay ahead. The ceremonial heart of the Persian Empire, a city not just of power, but of identity. When Alexander entered Persepolis, he stood at the center of everything the Persians had built. The palaces, the halls, the inscriptions, all of it represented centuries of dominance, culture, and rule. And then he burned it. Flames rose into the night, consuming the great halls of kings. Gold melted, columns cracked. The symbol of Persian power was reduced to ash. Some say it was revenge for the Persian invasion of Greece generations before. Others say it was a drunken mistake. But the truth may be simpler. It was a message. The old empire was gone, completely, irreversibly. And yet, even as the fire died, Alexander himself began to change. Because destroying an empire is one thing, ruling it is something else entirely. He began to adopt Persian customs, Persian dress, Persian court rituals. To his Macedonian generals, men who had fought beside him since the beginning, it was unsettling. This was not the king they had followed. This was someone new. Alexander no longer saw himself as just a Macedonian ruler. He saw himself as the ruler of a vast, diverse world. A king not of one people, but of many. He encouraged the fusion of cultures, promoted Persians into positions of power, even adopted elements of Persian royal ceremony that placed him above traditional expectations of leadership. To some, it was vision. To others, it was betrayal. Tension began to grow, because the men who had helped him conquer the world had expected to share in its rewards, not to be replaced within it. But Alexander was no longer thinking like a general. He was thinking like an emperor. And emperors do not look backward. They look forward, always, beyond Persia, beyond what had already been achieved, toward something even greater. Because, despite everything, despite the fall of Persia, despite the wealth, the power, the absolute dominance, Alexander was not satisfied. There were still lands unconquered, still horizons unexplored, still limits that he refused to accept. And so, as the ashes of Persepolis faded into history, a new idea took hold in his mind. If he had conquered the greatest empire on earth, then what remained? The answer lay far to the east, in lands unknown to his army, in territories untouched by Macedonian power, in a place that would test him in ways no enemy ever had: India. Chapter 6. Beyond the edge of the world. Persia had fallen. Babylon bowed. Susa yielded. Persepolis burned. By every measure known to the ancient world, Alexander the Great had achieved the impossible. He had destroyed the Achaemenid Empire and crowned himself king of Asia. Most rulers would have stopped. Alexander did not, because conquest, to him, was not about territory. It was about limits, and he did not believe in them. Beyond Persia lay lands the Greeks barely understood, vast territories of mountains, deserts, and warrior tribes. Regions like Bactria and Sogdiana did not collapse like organized empires. They resisted differently, not with massive armies, but with endurance. Alexander marched into Central Asia, expecting submission. Instead, he found rebellion, guerrilla warfare, ambushes, cities that surrendered by day and revolted by night. This was not the structured battlefield of Gaugamela. This was chaos. For the first time in his campaigns, Alexander was forced to adapt to an enemy that would not meet him in open combat. He built fortresses, founded cities to secure supply lines, married into local nobility, taking Roxana, a Bactrian noblewoman, as his wife, not merely out of affection, but strategy. He was not just conquering land, he was trying to hold it, and holding territory proved far more difficult than taking it. The campaigns in Central Asia dragged on for years. They hardened his army, they hardened him, and they changed him, because the farther east he moved, the more he distanced himself from Macedon, not just geographically, but culturally. His soldiers noticed Persian dress, Eastern customs, increasing demands. They followed him, still but no longer without question. Yet Alexander pressed onward, because beyond Central Asia lay something greater: India. To the Greeks, it was the edge of the known world, a land of rivers wider than seas, of exotic animals, of kingdoms wealthy and powerful. It was mysterious, dangerous, perfect. In 326 BCE, Alexander crossed the Indus River, entering the Indian subcontinent. Some local rulers submitted immediately, others prepared for war. Among them was Porus, ruler of a powerful kingdom near the Hydaspes River. Porus did not flee, he did not surrender. He prepared to fight. And for the first time, Alexander faced something entirely new on the battlefield: war elephants. Massive, armored beasts that towered over men and horses alike. They were living weapons, terrifying, unpredictable, capable of breaking formations and spreading panic. Even seasoned Macedonian soldiers hesitated at the sight. But Alexander had faced the impossible before. The battle at the Hydaspes was fought under storm and darkness. Alexander executed a daring maneuver, secretly crossing the river upstream during heavy rain, catching Porus off guard. When battle was joined, it was brutal. The elephants charged, the phalanx strained. Horses panicked at the scent and sound of the beasts. It was not a clean victory. It was a struggle. But discipline prevailed. The Macedonian forces adapted. isolating the elephants, targeting their handlers, breaking the cohesion of Paras's army. And in the end, Paras was captured, defeated, brought before Alexander. The king of India stood tall, despite his loss, wounded, exhausted, but unbowed. Alexander asked him how he wished to be treated. Porus answered, like a king. It was the kind of response Alexander understood and respected. Instead of executing him, Alexander restored Porus to his throne and even expanded his territory. It was not mercy alone, it was recognition. Alexander saw in Porus a reflection of himself, strong, proud, unwilling to kneel. But victory in India came at a cost. The monsoon rains were relentless, the rivers endless, the jungles suffocating. The army had marched for nearly a decade. They had crossed continents, fought countless battles, and now they were tired, exhausted, not just in body, but in spirit. Alexander wanted to march farther east, toward the Ganges, toward lands even larger and richer than anything yet conquered. But this time, his army refused. At the Hyphasis River, they stopped, not in rebellion, not in anger, but in exhaustion. They had followed him to the edge of the world, and they would go no further. For the first time in his life, Alexander faced something he could not conquer. Not an empire, not a king, not a battlefield, but the limits of human endurance. For days, he withdrew into his tent, refusing to accept it. But even he understood the reality. An army unwilling to march is an army already lost. Reluctantly, he gave the order to turn back. It was not defeat, but it was not victory either. It was something new, a boundary. And as the Macedonian army began its long march home, one truth became unavoidable. Alexander had conquered nearly everything, except the one thing he desired most, infinity. Chapter 7. The Long Road Home. Victory had carried Alexander the Great farther than any Macedonian king had ever dreamed. From the plains of Greece to the burning heart of Persia, from Egypt's sacred temples to the distant rivers of India, he had chased something greater than conquest. He had chased the edge of the known world, and he had found it. But standing at that edge, something unexpected happened. His army refused to go any further. After years of relentless campaigning, countless battles, wounds, and deaths, the Macedonian soldiers had reached their limit. At the Hyphasis River in India, they stood in silent defiance. No rebellion, no violence, just exhaustion. Alexander, who had never accepted no as an answer, faced the one enemy he could not defeat, the will of his own men. For days, he argued, he pleaded, he reminded them of glory, of destiny, of lands beyond. But the soldiers had seen enough, they had bled enough, and for the first time in his life, Alexander turned back. The decision was not defeat, but it felt like one. The return journey would prove far more dangerous than the advance. Conquering an empire was one thing. Holding it together while retreating across thousands of kilometers of hostile terrain was another. Alexander refused to retrace his steps fully. That would be too simple, too safe. Instead, he divided his forces. Part of his army would sail along the coast under Granicus, while he would lead the rest through one of the most unforgiving landscapes on Earth, the Gedrosian Desert. It was a decision that would haunt his legacy, the Gedrosian nightmare. The Gedrosian Desert was not just a desert, it was a graveyard. There was no reliable water, no shelter, no mercy. The sun did not shine, it punished. Days turned into a blur of heat and thirst. Soldiers collapsed where they stood. Horses died. Supplies vanished faster than expected. Sandstorms swallowed entire units without warning. This was no longer a march, it was survival. Ancient sources would later describe one moment that captured the essence of Alexander's leadership. A small amount of water was brought to Himberley, enough for one man. Instead of drinking it, he poured it into the sand. If they could not drink, neither would he. It was a gesture of unity, of defiance. But it did not change reality. Men continued to die. Thousands, not in battle, not in glory, but in silence, under an indifferent sky. For perhaps the first time, Alexander faced a force he could not outmaneuver, could not intimidate, could not conquer: nature itself. The cost of ambition. The march through Gedrosia was not a tactical necessity. It was a statement. Alexander wanted to prove that nothing, not even the harshest environment on earth, could stop him, that his army could endure what others could not, that his legend was not bound by geography. But legends have limits, and the cost was devastating. By the time the survivors emerged from the desert, the army that had once shaken the world was no longer the same. It was thinner, weaker, haunted. Victory had taken its toll. When Alexander finally reached more stable territories of the former Achaemenid Empire, the contrast was overwhelming. Cities still stood, roads still functioned, life in some form continued. But the empire he returned to was not the same one he had conquered. Years of war had reshaped it. New governors had risen. Loyalties had shifted. Tensions between Macedonians and Persians simmered beneath the surface. Alexander no longer ruled just as a conqueror. He ruled as a king of a vast, fragile system. And that system was beginning to strain. A changed king. The man who returned from India was not the same man who had left. He had seen the limits of conquest. He had faced refusal. He had watched his army suffer, not at the hands of enemies, but because of his own decisions. And yet, he did not abandon his vision. Instead, he began to think differently, not just about conquering the world, but about uniting it. He encouraged marriages between Macedonians and Persians. He adopted elements of Persian dress and court ritual. He envisioned an empire not divided by culture, but fused into something new. To some, this was brilliance. To others, betrayal. Because the further Alexander moved away from his Macedonian roots, the more uncertain his identity became. Was he still their king, or had he become something else entirely? The edge behind him. Alexander had reached the edge of the known world and turned back. But the journey home proved something even greater than conquest. That even the most powerful man alive could not control everything. Not his army, not nature, not the cost of his own ambition. The road behind him was marked not just by victories, but by graves. And ahead lay a different kind of challenge. Not conquering new lands, but holding together everything he had already taken. After years of relentless conquest, Alexander the Great stood at the pinnacle of power, but his vast empire, stretching across continents, was far from stable. Returning from the harsh Gedrosian desert, he faced a new kind of battle: governance. To unite his diverse realm, Alexander adopted Persian customs and attire. He even embraced the practice of proskynesis, a Persian act of reverence. This cultural fusion, however, caused deep resentment among his loyal Macedonian troops. They saw it as a betrayal of their heritage and a sign of Alexander's changing loyalties. In 324 BCE, Alexander orchestrated the mass wedding at Susa. Thousands of his soldiers were married to Persian women, a bold policy to fuse civilizations. Alexander himself married Statera II, daughter of Darius III, solidifying his vision. Yet, beneath the surface, discontent simmered, threatening to boil over. Tensions reached their peak at Apis when Alexander announced the integration of Persian soldiers. The Macedonian army mutinied, demanding to be sent home. Alexander responded, not with force, but with a dramatic display of authority. He dismissed them, replacing his guard with Persians, leaving his veterans stunned, begging forgiveness. The Macedonians eventually reconciled, but the bond was forever changed. Alexander chose Babylon as the new center of his vast empire. He envisioned a global civilization, a true fusion of East and West. But with this grand vision came a profound sense of isolation. The weight of governing such a diverse and often resistant empire was immense. The empire still stood, a testament to his will, but cracks were forming beneath the surface. He had conquered the world, but now faced a different battle, holding it together. By the time Alexander the Great established his court in Babylon, his empire had already reshaped the known world. But something even more powerful than territory had begun to spread: his name. It no longer belonged to a man. It had become a force. Across the ancient world, stories traveled faster than armies. Merchants carried them along trade routes. Survivors whispered them in ruined cities. Envoys repeated them in royal courts. Alexander was no longer just a king of Macedon. He was a legend before his own death. His victories were not ordinary. At Gaugamela, he had shattered the might of the Persian Empire against overwhelming odds. At Tyre, he had conquered a city thought impossible to breach by building a causeway across the sea. In Egypt, he was not resisted, he was worshipped. Each victory added another layer to his reputation, not just as a conqueror, but as something unstoppable. In Egypt, at the Oracle of Siwa, Alexander was declared the son of Zusammen. Whether he believed it fully or not no longer mattered. Others did, and belief shapes power. In Persia, he adopted royal customs. In Egypt, he became pharaoh. In the eyes of many, he was no longer merely human. He was chosen, destined, divine. As his legend grew, something remarkable began to happen. Many enemies chose not to fight. Cities opened their gates before his army even arrived. Rulers sent tribute instead of armies. Resistance began to feel pointless. Alexander had achieved something few conquerors ever do. He won battles before they began. Fear became a weapon, not through cruelty alone, but through inevitability. To face Alexander was to face defeat. At least, that is what the world had come to believe. From Greece to India, from the deserts of Egypt to the mountains of Central Asia, every ruler now measured themselves against him. Some sought alliance, some prepared for war, some simply hoped to survive. But none could ignore him, because Alexander had done something unprecedented. He had connected regions that had never before shared a common political reality. His empire became a bridge between worlds. Greek ideas flowed east. Eastern wealth flowed west. Cultures collided, merged, and transformed. The consequences would outlive him by centuries. But there is a cost to becoming a legend while still alive: expectation. Alexander could no longer afford to fail. Every campaign had to succeed. Every decision had to reinforce the myth. Because if the illusion broke, so might the empire. And perhaps, somewhere deep within, he knew it. Despite everything, Alexander was still human. he drank heavily, he grieved deeply, he trusted and, sometimes, misjudged. He executed allies when he suspected betrayal. He pushed himself beyond limits no one else would accept. The legend was growing, but the man was wearing thin. Fear could win obedience, but it could not guarantee loyalty. And as the empire expanded, as cultures mixed and tensions rose, Alexander faced a question that no conqueror could escape. Would his empire endure because people believed in him, more simply because they feared him? Because fear fades, and when it does, what remains? By the end of his campaigns, Alexander's name carried weight beyond geography. It symbolized ambition without limit, victory against impossible odds, a vision of unity that defied tradition, but also relentless pressure, isolation, and the burden of being greater than any man should be. He had become what he once chased, a figure larger than life, a story in motion, a force of history. But even the greatest names must face an ending. Chapter 10: The Final Campaign. By the time Alexander the Great stood at the height of his power in Babylon, no enemies could challenge him directly. No rival empire remained. No army could match his experience, his speed, his command. And yet he was not finished, because Alexander had never been driven by what existed, only by what remained. His empire already stretched across 3 continents, but in his mind it was incomplete. Arabia lay unconquered. The western Mediterranean remained untouched. There were rumors of lands beyond oceans yet to be crossed. Alexander began preparing for a new campaign. Ships were commissioned, harbors expanded, supply systems reorganized, intelligence gathered. This was not a king consolidating power. This was a man preparing to push even further beyond the limits of the known world. But beneath the surface, cracks were widening. The empire depended on Alexander himself, his authority, his presence, his decisions. Without him, there was no clear system strong enough to hold everything together. His generals were loyal but also ambitious. Men like Ptolemy, Seleucus, and Perdiccas had fought beside him for years. They respected him, but they also understood power, and they knew that one day that power would be up for claim. In 323 BCE, during a series of banquets in Babylon, Alexander fell ill. At first, it seemed minor, a fever, fatigue, but it did not pass. Days went by. His condition worsened. He could no longer speak clearly. His strength faded. His condition worsened. He could no longer speak clearly. His strength faded. The man who had marched across continents, who had survived countless battles, who had faced death again and again, was now defeated by something invisible. As his generals gathered around him, one question mattered above all: who would inherit the empire? According to tradition, Alexander gave a final answer to the strongest. Whether those were his exact words remains debated. But the meaning was clear. There was no chosen successor, no clear heir, only power waiting to be taken. At the age of just 32, Alexander died. No battlefield, no final charge, no enemy in sight, just silence. The greatest conqueror of the ancient world gone in a single moment of history. Outside, his army waited. Inside, his generals calculated. Across the empire, uncertainty spread. Inside, his generals calculated. Across the empire, uncertainty spread. Because without Alexander, everything changed. The unity he had forged began to fracture almost immediately. Alliances shifted. Rivalries emerged. The question was no longer how to expand the empire, but how to divide it. Alexander's last campaign was never fought. There were no battles, no victories, no conquests, only a realization that even the greatest ambition has a limit, and that limit is human. He had reached the edge of the world. He had conquered everything in his path. He had become a legend in his own lifetime. But in the end, he could not conquer time. When Alexander the Great died in Babylon, he did not leave behind a stable succession. He left behind a vacuum. And in history, a vacuum is never empty for long. Almost immediately, the empire began to fracture. There was no clear heir capable of ruling such a vast domain. Alexander's half-brother, Philip III, lacked authority. His infant son, Alexander IV, could not rule. So power fell into the hands of his generals, the men who had fought beside him, the men who had learned from him, the men who now turned against each other. They would become known as the Diadochitha successors. What followed was not a smooth transition. It was decades of war. Alliances formed and collapsed. Betrayals became routine. Former brothers-in-arms became enemies. The empire Alexander had built through unity was torn apart by ambition. Each general wanted a peace. None wanted to submit. And so, the empire burned. Out of the chaos, new powers emerged. Ptolemy, the first Sotar, took Egypt, establishing a dynasty. Seleucus I Nicator carved out a vast empire across Persia and the East. Antigonus I Monophthalmus sought to reunite the empire, but ultimately failed. The unified empire of Alexander no longer existed. In its place stood competing kingdoms. And yet, despite the wars, something remarkable endured. Alexander's vision did not disappear. It evolved. Greek culture spread across the East. Cities like Alexandria became centers of learning and trade. Ideas, philosophies, and technologies moved between civilizations. This period became known as the Hellenistic Age. A world where Greek and Eastern cultures blended into something entirely new. Alexander had not just conquered land, he had reshaped civilization. His empire collapsed, but his influence expanded. This is the paradox of Alexander. He failed to create a lasting political structure, yet succeeded in creating a lasting cultural transformation. His generals fought over territory, but his ideas moved freely across borders. Over time, Alexander became more than history. He became myth. Stories about him spread far beyond the lands he conquered. In different cultures, he was remembered differently. A heroic king, a divine ruler, a philosopher warrior, a symbol of ambition. Each version reflected the world he had touched. The empire was gone, but the fire remained. In cities, in language, in culture, in memory. Alexander's true legacy was not the land he ruled, but the world he changed. Because some conquerors leave behind ruins. Others leave behind systems. Alexander left behind something far more powerful. A transformation that could not be undone. And yet, one question still lingers. What does it mean to conquer the world if the world cannot be held? In the end, the story of Alexander the Great is not just the story of a conqueror. It is the story of a question that has echoed across centuries. What does it mean to conquer the world? He began as a boy, in Macedon, driven, restless, shaped by ambition and expectation. He inherited a kingdom, but not a legacy, that he would have to build himself. And he did, faster than anyone before him, harder than anyone imagined. From the moment he crossed into Asia, his life became a chain of victories. Each battle expanded not just his territory, but his belief that he was meant for something beyond ordinary kingship. And for a time, it seemed true. Alexander lived as if there were no limits, no boundary he could not cross, no army he could not defeat, no destiny he could not claim. And for years, reality agreed with him. Empires fell, cities surrendered, kings knelt, the world bent under his will. But every illusion carries within it a hidden truth. Not all limits are visible. Some are silent, some are patient, and some cannot be conquered. As Alexander's legend grew, so did the distance between him and the world around him. He was no longer simply a man. He was expected to be more, a king, a god, a symbol. And the higher he rose, the more isolated he became. Because no one stands beside a legend. They stand beneath it. Even after his death, the consequences of his actions continued to unfold. The lands he conquered did not return to what they had been. They transformed. Greek language spread across vast regions. Ideas moved between east and west. Cultures merged, adapted, and evolved. The world became more connected than it had ever been. Not because Alexander ruled it, but because he had reshaped it. Alexander achieved what many believed impossible. He conquered the known world, and yet he could not keep it. His empire fractured almost immediately after his death. His generals fought. His legacy splintered into competing kingdoms. Power, it turns out, is easier to take than to hold. What did Alexander gain? Glory, immortality in history, a name that would never be forgotten. But what did he lose? Time, peace, the simple life he could never return to, and perhaps, in the end, himself. Alexander's story is not a lesson with a simple answer. It is a mirror to ambition, to power, to the human desire to go beyond what is possible. He shows us what can be achieved and what it costs. In the end, even the greatest conqueror could not escape the one truth that defines us all. He was human. He could shape the world, but he could not escape it. And so, his story does not end with victory. It ends with reflection. Because history does not remember Alexander only for the lands he conquered, but for the question he left behind. If you could take the world, would you be able to keep it?